Hi folks, John Cordisco back again with another great chess video for you. This is a game that was played, it was the Armageddon game, and I'll go into a little more detail about that in a minute, that settled the winner of the U.S. Championship for 2013. It was between Kamsky as white and Alejandro Ramirez as black. Now the background on this is, during the course of the tournament, Alejandro seems to be an escape artist. To give you an idea, during the regular tournament, not the playoff, Kamsky had him, and at the last minute he found a move that saved himself and drew. So at the end of the tournament they both tied. So they played two rapid games. I think there were 40-45 minutes on each side, and both times Alejandro was losing to Kamsky and found a move at the last minute that drew and saved himself. So now they're at the third playoff game, the Armageddon game. Now, for those of you that don't know what an Armageddon game is, it's a winner no matter what happens. In this case, they were given the lowest amount of time that they would pick in a secret sealed bid, so to speak. And Kamsky picked 20 minutes. And they opened that and got us 20 minutes. Alejandro kind of outsmarted him again and picked 19 minutes and 45 seconds. So here's this guy again, the Houdini here. He ends up with a choice. He takes black and draw odds, and that means white has to win. If the game is drawn, white loses, and he loses the U.S. Championship. Kamsky is a very elite player. He's in the top 20 in the world. Alejandro Ramirez is about 25-50, still a grandmaster, still a very, very strong player. But to get this far is quite an achievement, and I'll give him that. So Alejandro started 19 minutes and 45 seconds, Kamsky as white 45 minutes. So it was almost 20 minutes to 45, and I'm going to go in a little more detail after, but I don't want to bore you all with all my rhetoric. So it's going to be a King's Indian. Has black, Gata has white, Alejandro has black. Knight to f3, c5, g3, c takes, knight takes, g6, bishop to g2. I like how that light squared bishop is just bearing down that diagonal. Bishop to g7, castles, castles, c4, c7, and knight to a3, which was kind of a surprise. I remember I was lucky enough to watch most of this game live. I was on the internet, of course. I have a convenience store, and I got to peek at it every once in a while. The computer gives, instead of knight to a3, a sequence of moves: b3, knight to c6, knight to c3, d5, knight takes, b takes, c takes, c takes, knight takes, b takes, bishop to h3. That's quite a sequence there. But Gata went knight to a3 instead. Ramirez went d6, knight b to d5, threatening the queen. Queen to d8. Now you're going to see some somewhat passive moves here from black. Reason being that he only has to draw. Now granted, he has a little less than 20 minutes to Gata's 45. But this is, you'll see that maybe he pulls back a little bit. That's the reason why. He only has to draw. I'll tell you the truth, I don't care if you're a grandmaster or not. It's tough to beat a grandmaster when he's just playing to draw. Bishop to g5. Knight to c6. Queen to d2. a6, kicking the knight. Knight goes back to c3. f5. That's a pretty good square there. This bishop's covering some key squares. And e4, right away, challenge the bishop. He goes back to e6. Knight to d5, d7. There you go. There's the passive play. He was afraid, of course, that knight would take knight. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and they'll give him an isolated pawn here. That was probably the fear. I think instead of knight to d7, the computer suggests rook to c8, and it suggests bishop takes, knight takes, e takes, b3. And I'm running my computer off screen, and it's got a very, very small advantage for white. At this point, I think we're going to take a pause for these messages. Okay, folks, welcome back. I also wanted to comment, my last few videos, the last dozen or so plus, I've put in these kind of funny commercials or maybe some old school 70s or 80s commercials, and I hope people enjoy them. I do it for fun. Please comment, how you guys like those, or you don't like them. That's okay too. But I think they're kind of fun just to look back and maybe remember some of the old days, or maybe get a chuckle or a laugh. Anyway, after knight to d7, Kamsky goes rook a to c1. Now you got to remember the times are ticking down, especially for Ramirez. But you got to remember he only has to draw to win the U.S. championship. I mean, last year when Ramirez played, I think he was next to last. So this is an incredible dream for him to get this far and then draw Kamsky twice in playoff games and get to an Armageddon game and get black, which means he only has to draw to win the U.S. championship. And by the way, I think the first prize is $30,000. That's not talking about the money you can make going around the country for appearances and things like that, invitations you might get to tournaments now, and the money that will come from that. And also, I believe the top 5 out of here go to the World Cup, which is a series of tournaments to determine the next world champion. So there's a ton at stake here for this young guy. And I've met Ramirez once. I mean, not personally. I remember I ran into him. He was being interviewed at the Amateur Team East Championship in New Jersey a couple of years ago. He's a nice kid. He's originally from Costa Rica. Anyway, after that, rook to c8. You can see he's just building. He's just moving. And by the way, they're getting a 5-second increment, which means they're getting 5 seconds added to each of their clocks every time they move. b3, rook to e8, h3. Now that prevents the bishop from coming here, or anything else in the future for that matter. Knight on d to e5. He's rerouting that knight. If you remember, the knight was here, and he went to here, and now he's coming back up. That's a good spot. King to h1. And that was kind of interesting. I remember during the commentary they were telling why God did that. Normally you would think the king would come here to guard this pawn. But the reality of it is, if the queen comes here, bishop takes, and the king is here, bishop will take, and then knight check, and you lose the queen. So that was kind of slick. Rook to b8. Black's a little cramped, but he really doesn't mind. He's got a solid position. He's not the greatest in the world. It shows white with about a 3/4 of a pawn advantage. Instead of rook to b8, maybe knight back to d7 is computer's choice, and then knight to c2. After rook to b8, Kamsky goes knight to c2, which was the good move anyway. And then queen to d7. Now, I remember Yasser Seirawan was commenting on this game with Jennifer Shahadi, and he didn't like this move at all. In fact, he wanted the knight should be on d7 and then bishop d3. That kind of hems in the light squared bishop, if you notice here. He really doesn't have anywhere to go. And he's not really threatening anything either, except for that little trick. And if you notice now, got his king in the spot where it can't be checked here and lose the queen. He saw that as well. Knight to b6, threatening the queen. Queen goes right back. That's basically a lost tempo. Now that knight's in a good spot, kind of hindering the rook on b8. Bishop d3. Knight back to d7. If you can see, he's going back and forth. Remember, he has a small amount of time, but he's just trying to stay solid. He wants to draw. Knight to d5. Knight to c5. Getting that knight up there, finally getting a little bit of offense. Now, if you notice, black's on his heels. He's basically from the third rank down, whereas you see white is all the way up. I mean, he's got a lot to play with here. So you can see black's pretty cramped. So Gotti goes f4 right off the shoot, starting to go after him. b5, c takes, a takes. Now the computer suggests instead of a takes for black, if rook took b5 instead, and it has a question mark, it would go b4, bishop takes, pawn takes, and it's really not that great. It's a big advantage for white. I think at this point we're going to take a pause for these messages.
Hey, how about a movie tonight, huh?
Wow, what's that aftershave you're wearing?
You high karate aftershave is so powerful, it drives women right out of their minds. That's why we have to put instructions on self-defense in every package. High karate, the brisk splash-on aftershave that smooths and soothes and cools. High karate, aftershave, cologne, and gift sets. High karate, be careful how you use.
Welcome back, folks. At this point, I remember watching, I ended up taping it and watching it later so I could watch the very end, but Ramirez is a pretty young guy, kind of a baby face, and I'll tell you, as the game wore on, he looked like he aged about 20 years. I mean, he's a young guy. I don't think he's 23, and here he is playing against Kamsky, one of the elite players in the world for the U.S. Championship. I mean, man, this guy's heart must have been going 120 beats a minute plus. Anyway, after a takes b5, he pushes right through, gains some space with f5. Now the clocks are starting to come down now. Remember, Ramirez only had 19 minutes and 45 seconds. If I recall, he was probably down about 5 or 6 minutes at this point. I think Kamsky might have had 18 or 20 minutes, where they have a 5-second increment. Bishop takes d5. It's an interesting move that I want to try is bishop to d7. It's got a exclamation point and a question mark, so I'm assuming that this means interesting. E takes d5. Now instead of that, I think maybe queen takes, then knight to e5 might have been a better choice. It's about a half a point advantage currently with that scenario with white. Now it's about a pawn and a quarter. Knight to e5. He's starting to come up a little bit. And knight to b4. Now it's funny, the computer shows a scenario when knight to d4, then knight on c to d3, rook to c2, and rook to a8. And that's funny because that's the exact same series of moves that Jennifer Shahadi and Yasser Seirawan picked as well. And they showed the computer with Grandmaster Maurice Ashley that knight to d4 was a little bit more accurate. So he's got a Kamsky's elite player. That little inaccuracy is a big deal. Instead of going knight to b4, you should go knight to d4 instead. After knight to b4, they were looking at this and it was funny, and they mentioned, well, you know, Alejandro will just throw out caution to the wind and go queen to a5 and give up the pawn. Because you're going to see the exchange here where black loses a pawn. But it's only way to have any counterplay. And I got to give it to Ramirez. He went queen to a5 just like the computer suggested. So it's bishop takes, pawn takes, rook takes. So now white is up a pawn. And he gave that pawn up on purpose because he's just so penned in. He needs some counterplay. And so he sacrificed that pawn to do that. I'll give Ramirez that. And he also, if you notice, it's a really, really annoying pin on this knight on the queen. Rook b to c8, rook takes, rook takes. At this point, it's about 3/4 of a pawn, almost a full pawn advantage for white. F takes, H takes, and queen to F4. Now that was a scenario that Yasser Seirawan suggested, and that's exactly what they did. I'll tell you, Yasser, for a guy that's been retired 8-10 years, he sure knows what he's talking about. Of course, it's easy just to move the pieces when you're not playing, but even still, I'll give him that. I wish he'd start playing again. I mean, at the higher level, see if he can make it back up again. Queen to c7 and a4. Computer suggests maybe an interesting move would have been knight to c6, and it went bishop f6, and then king to h2. After a4, bishop takes, pawn takes, and then f4. That's another move that the computer showed, that Grandmaster Maurice Ashley showed when they were doing the commentary. That's a computer move. It's opening up your king, but it's the only way to keep your position. And I'll give Ramirez this again. He found it again. He seems to find his way out of these situations. He's great at defending. And that's the side of a good player, especially elite grandmasters. They're all very good players, but the elite players seem to have a level of resistance that are higher than most, and that's why they're elite. And I'll tell you, in this tournament, Ramirez played like an elite player. I'll give him that. Knight to c6, knight takes, queen takes queen, rook takes, pawn takes. Now this is where Ramirez goes wrong. It's about 3/4 of a pawn advantage for Kamsky, who was white. And the computer suggests king to f7 or king to f8, king f7 being the better choice. And this is where he goes wrong. He goes e5, double question mark. Now it's almost a 2-pawn advantage for white. He's a pawn up material. Computer shows that king to f7 and says the rescuing straw, which I thought was kind of cheeky, as the English say. I think at this point we're going to stop for this message.
Mamma mia, that's some species.
Got spicy meatballs, Jack. Take 28.
Out, Tony, and action. Mamma mia, that's a spicy meatball.
Cut. The accent.
Huh?
Cut. Cut.
Micey, ballsy, ballsy.
Cut. Take 59.
And action.
Sometimes you eat more than you should, and when
Yeah.
it's spicy besides, Mamma Mia, do you need Alka-Seltzer? Alka-Seltzer can help unstuff you, relieve the acid indigestion, and help make you your old self again.
Mamma mia, that's a spicy meatball.
Cut. Okay. Let's break through.
Hi folks, welcome back. That was the key mistake, I think, e5 for Ramirez. Now it jumps to a 2.5-point advantage for white. Now before that move, it was about 3/4 of a pawn, maybe close to a pawn. As the computer goes up here, I can see it. King to e7 was the preferred move. After e5 goes bishop d5 check. Black's in kind of a bind here. Now remember, he only has to draw. And remember, this is the 3rd time at the last minute he's found his saving move to draw Kamsky. Once in the regular rounds during the regular part of the championship, and then 2 playoff rapid games, he found a draw at the last minute to save himself. So he's probably thinking the same thing now, even though it's over 2.5 pawns advantage for white at this point, and he's a pawn up in material. king to f8 after the check, g4, king to e7. He's got to get that king up there. As we all know, king is a really powerful piece in the endgame. It's worth about 4 points, which is more than a knight or a bishop and just a little bit less than a rook. G takes, G takes. Rook takes f5. Now, he gave up that pawn. What he's probably thinking, at least in part, as his time is slowly ticking down, got to remember, he's down now to almost the increment. He was down to 2 seconds. I forget which move it was coming up, but he was down to 2 seconds. And the increment was saving him. He's probably thinking this, at least in part. If he can get this pawn and this pawn taken somehow, some way, in other words, maybe trade the rooks off, and if he can get this bishop for these 2 pawns, he can draw. And how can he do that? Well, he can draw. In fact, the arrows are still there. I'll just leave them. He can draw because if this is the only pawn left for white, he has a light squared bishop. It's the wrong color. So you can be a piece and a pawn ahead and still draw. I think that's partially going through his mind, plus other things as well. After rook takes, king to d6, get his king right up there. Of course, Gata backs off with bishop f3, still guarding the c-pawn. Rook to a7. Now Ramirez goes after Gata's a-pawn. g5, going after the bishop first. e4. It's a pretty gutsy move. And actually, it's funny, the computer shows bishop to f8 doesn't get the bull off the ice, whatever that means. And then the suggestion was rook to g4, guarding the other pawn. After e4, of course, Gata has to take it. And he does. Bishop to e5. It's slowly creeping up for white. It's a little over a 3-point advantage right now. We'll say 3 points, which is a full piece. Rook to g6, check. King to c5. He's trying. And at this point, he's basically on fumes. I mean, he's burned out. Luckily, he's young, so he can take the pressure, and his mind works a little bit better when you're younger. But he's basically living on the increment. He has seconds left every time he moves. Bishop to f3 for Gata. At this point, I think Gata had 4, 5, 8 minutes left. He had a ton of time. King to b6. Rook to g5, threatening the bishop again. Rook to a5. It shows that rook to e7. It says doesn't get the cat out of the tree. Kind of cute, because it would have been h4. After rook to h5, he just goes h4, and here comes the h-pawn. Now you notice that none of Gata's pieces here, over here, are on dark squares, especially the king. There's no hidden checks by the bishop anywhere to try to save it at the end. King to c7 for black. h5. King to d6. Rook to h6. Excuse me, h6. Rook takes a. Now, for some reason, my computer didn't go through the rest of the game. I'm trying to do this from memory. What happens at this point is Gata plays rook takes e5, exclamation point. Black has to take. He doesn't have a choice. And Gata went c7. And Ramirez resigned. There's no way he can stop them both. The rook can't stop both pawns. If the rook goes here, this pawn moves. And then rook takes, and then the pawn queens. If he goes after this pawn queens. And the game is over. I'll give Ramirez this. He did a heck of a job to hold his own in 3 draws when 2 of the games were probably lost. I think 3 of the games are probably lost for Ramirez. He found a draw at the very end to save himself, and it looked like he was going to do it again, but the luck ran out, and Kamsky is the new U.S. champion. Now, he was champion in 2011. Nakamura won it in 2012. The defending champion wasn't here this year, Hikaru Nakamura, because he's playing in that huge super tournament in Norway. And frankly, I can't blame him. I mean, the list of the guys that are that tournament are pretty steep. You've got Nakamura, you've got Carlson, you've got Aronian, you've got Anand, Topalov, Karyakin, Nakamura himself. I think that rounds out the field is Peter Svidler, 6-time Russian champion, and also Hammer. I love that name. He's from Norway. They're having it in Norway. He's a good guy. He's pretty fun. I've seen him on interviews. Anyway, folks, it was a heck of a game to watch. It went down to the final seconds. If any of you want to see it in its entirety, I believe it's on chesschamps.com. USChessChamps.com, which is the website for the St. Louis Chess Club and Scholastic Center. And I want you to remember, folks, if you think chess is just a game, you're not playing it right. And I have all of you comment, or please subscribe. I would personally appreciate it. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.